People rarely talk about how difficult it can be to make your guitar sound good in production, so I'm going to be sharing 5 very easy production tips that I've learned and use regularly that help my guitars go from sounding like a music zero to a guitar hero. I failed to mention this in the video, but these are all tricks that I wish someone told me, and they would have elevated my productions years ago. And I'm not sharing anything with you that I haven't tried or I don't do. I use everything I'm mentioning in this video. Why do people recommend things that they don't actually do? I don't know, that's crazy, but back to the video. I normally work with electric guitars, so most of these tips will be directed towards electric guitars, but they can just as easily be applied to acoustics as well. But not if you only play chords. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm not. I will be using Ableton, but these tips are the same regardless of your DAW. This one is first up because it should be the first thing you do. EQ your guitars. If you were to take away anything from this video, this has to be it. The first thing you should do on all of your guitar tracks is properly EQ them. This is something I completely ignored when I first started recording guitar music, but trust me, it is necessary. And objectively speaking, this is the proper foundation to begin with when you're EQing your guitars. First, set a low pass filter between 8 to 10 kilohertz, and then a high pass filter somewhere around 60 hertz. These two filters are cutting out frequencies that you do not need. There's no sound detail outside of these ranges, but they do carry static and extra noise, so we're clearing up that space to make sure the guitars sound good. Also, if you find that your guitars are still carrying too much bass, feel free to set the high pass filter closer to 100 hertz, but ideally I wouldn't recommend going past that. Lastly, you're going to cut the gain between 3 to 4 kilohertz. This is to get rid of the harsh frequencies that are present in electric guitars, especially when you're running distortion on them. And just because you can't hear something on your computer or studio monitors doesn't mean it's not there. If you can see it in the frequency chart, there's almost always a speaker that can hear it. Now, if your guitars are getting lost in the mix and you need them to sit louder, you can increase the gain around 1 to 2 kilohertz, as well as between 100 to 250 hertz. You may be thinking, why can't I increase the gain in the mids? And it's not that you can't, but if you have 10 different tracks in your project, by default, most of your sounds are going to fall in the middle. So if you're just cranking up the gain in the middle frequencies, you're increasing the likelihood that your instrument could clash with another element of your project. And for electric guitars, the more gain you have in the mids, the less sound clarity you have. So keep that in mind. Just always remember that mids are muddy. Think about when you're listening to a song that has a sharp lead guitar. In order for that lead guitar to cut through the drums, the rhythm guitar, the bass, the treble is what has to be dialed up. And in terms of EQ frequencies, that's everything from the highs to the high mids. By applying this basic EQ adjustment, you'll at least have a solid foundation to build from. It's definitely not the end all, but it is a good start. Now, if you've ever wondered how to get your melodies to sound grand in a production, pan your guitars. This is a trick that I use in pretty much all of my songs. Panning your guitars helps them to sound full and wide. This also creates space in the middle of the mix for anything else that you're adding. While it isn't always necessary, I found that in most cases, unless you're already panning other elements in your track, there's not much harm it can do. What you'll be doing is playing the exact same melody, chord, riff, whatever it is, on 2 different tracks, and then you're going to hard pan those tracks left and right. Now, the literal definition of hard panning is to send an instrument entirely to the left speaker or entirely to the right speaker. But personally, I found that the tracks sound too isolated when there's no overlap in between. So when I utilize this technique, I pan the tracks 75% to each side so they blend together just a little, and this also corrects for any small differences that may exist between the 2 tracks. Just to clarify, you cannot just duplicate the same track and then pan it left and right. You have to actually have 2 different recordings because it's the differences in timing and playing that create the stereo space we're after. Rhythm guitars are normally what's going to sound the best panned because it makes room for other parts that are typically centered, like the drums or a lead guitar run, but this is not limited strictly to rhythm sections. On several occasions, I've panned lead melodies to increase their presence, and it sounds wonderful. You have to do this sparingly though, because if you make everything too wide, the project will sound empty. There has to at least be something going on in the center in order for your song to sound balanced. Also, if you're using this for a segment that is meant to be at the front of the mix, you don't always have to hard pan it. Even just panning the two tracks like 50% to each side can go a long way and still be effective at broadening the width of that sound. If you've never tried this technique, you literally have to. I promise it will be night and day when you hear the difference. This next tip is so slept on, and I've yet to hear anyone mention it. If you're feeling like your guitar tone is weak or just missing some oomph, double track your guitars. This is particularly useful when you're looking to increase clarity in distorted tones. And when I say double track, you don't have to record the same melody like you would when you're panning. What you're doing here is duplicating your track, ideally one that's distorted, and on that track, you'll give the guitar a clean tone with minimal distortion, if any. All you want is a clear neutral tone that's not too heavy. The volume of this track also has to be lower than your initial track with distortion, because all it's doing is compensating for the areas where the distortion loses detail. And just for reference, distortion typically loses clarity in the mids and lows, especially if your project has a lot going on. If you have a $2,000 guitar that already has great coloring and tone clarity, then you may not benefit as much from this. But if you're looking to blend different guitar tones or just clean up some heavy distortion, then you have to try this out. If you want to hear this trick in action to really hear what I'm talking about, I used it in my song Force of Habit, and I'll add the link to my playthrough of that video in the description if you want to check it out. This next one is more of a production trick overall, but it can really make a difference if you're layering several guitars. Clear out the frequencies you don't need. This is very similar to just EQing your guitars, but this one's a little different. This is a tip that you should use to some extent in all of your mixes, but it is super useful in creating separation when you have a lot of guitars in your project. You can start applying this to specific segments of your song once you've added most of the elements to your project. If you have a guitar track that is emphasizing a certain frequency, like a guitar solo that's played high up on the fretboard, or some punchy power chords that have a strong mids presence, isolate those frequencies to help separate them from the rest of the mix. This concept is heavily utilized in metal music due to all of the gain and distortion that has to be filtered out across the guitars. If you've ever wondered how hard rock music is able to sound so crispy, even with heavy distortion, this is how. Fundamentally, mixing a song is nothing more than adjusting for clarity across all aspects of the project, and that's exactly what you're doing here. This doesn't need to be done for every single track per se, but this is the easiest way to clean up unwanted noise and ensure only the sounds you want are coming through the mix. Just solo any track in your project and pay attention to where most of your sound frequencies are. And from there, just dial out the ones that aren't contributing to the sound you want. If you're having issues and everything is sounding cluttered in your project, this will definitely help you out. This last one is one that I didn't actively make use of until I had been producing for a few years, and it makes a huge difference. So shout out to Fino for explaining this one to me. Parallel process your effects. Parallel processing is also referred to as bus processing, and all this means is to send your track to what's called a return channel that has the effects on it that you want to add. What makes this such a game changer is that you're able to blend the wet and dry signals of your original track with the effects. So instead of dumping a heavy reverb or delay directly on your guitar track, you'll place them on a return channel, dial the wet signal up to 100, and then adjust how much of that effect you want on your track. By doing this, you can fine tune how much of the effect comes through, and it makes everything sound a lot more natural. The most common effect that this is used for is, of course, reverb, because it can easily dilute a track. Trust me, I love reverb more than the next person, but if you have several guitar tracks all with separate reverbs, it's pretty easy for them to get drowned out by each other. The process of how to do this does vary depending on the DAW you're using, but the concept is exactly the same no matter which program you're running. There's so many combinations when it comes to mixing, so the way you utilize these tricks may vary depending on preference, guitar tone, and plugins. The best sounds are the ones that use an array of techniques, so experiment with using some of these together and you'd be surprised by what comes out. At the end of the day, you really just have to listen to what sounds good, and the more you train your ears on what to look out for, the easier it becomes to mesh everything well whenever you're mixing. Hopefully you were able to learn at least one new thing that you can apply to your own productions, and if you found this helpful at all I ask is that you press the like button so that this video gets pushed to others who may find it useful. If you have any questions about what I mentioned, feel free to drop it in the comments and I'll do my best to help clear things up. As always, thanks for watching and I will see you guys next time.